The Ironwood Pack territory stretched across mountain valleys, whose isolation had fostered traditions that resisted change through generations of established authority that measured worth according to dominance hierarchies, whose rigid structure maintained order through carefully regulated power distribution that left little room for deviation from accepted patterns of submission and control, that Pack survival had supposedly required despite evidence that such arrangements often served individual ambition rather than collective welfare through systems designed to concentrate authority among those whose strength justified command over others. Within this realm of established hierarchy, the twin Omegas Ceres and Viola had spent 18 years learning survival through invisibility that protected them from attention, that rarely proved beneficial when directed toward those whose social position offered no protection against aristocratic whims or pack politics that could transform individual existence into object lesson about appropriate deference to established authority through demonstrations that served collective education about consequences of challenging accepted order. Their birth under broken moon, lunar eclipse that folklore claimed brought misfortune, had marked them as ominous from first breath, their twin status creating additional concern among pack elders who viewed such unusual circumstances as potential threat to social stability through disruption of normal family dynamics. That healthy pack relationships required, according to tradition, that emphasized individual identity over bonds that might challenge loyalty to broader community through competing allegiances. The cottage where they lived with adoptive family occupied marginal territory at pack boundaries, where those whose circumstances made them unsuitable for central community could exist without attracting attention. That integration would require, while contributing sufficient labor to justify continued residence despite social position, that offered no pathway for advancement through normal pack channels that rewarded dominance rather than cooperation. Their adoptive mother, Elena, had accepted responsibility for twins whose birth circumstances had made them unwanted, despite her own marginal position within pack hierarchy, as widow whose mate's death had eliminated any claim to status beyond charity that community obligation provided through minimal support that preserved life while maintaining clear boundaries about appropriate expectations for those whose circumstances required assistance. Keep quiet and stay together had become unofficial motto that guided their development through understanding that pack tolerance remained conditional upon behaviors that avoided disruption of established order, while demonstrating sufficient submission to satisfy those whose authority required constant reinforcement through deference from those whose position made resistance dangerous regardless of personal feelings about justice or fairness that circumstances might warrant. The pack itself existed under pressure from neighboring territories, whose expansion threatened traditional boundaries, while creating need for demonstration of strength that could discourage aggression through visible proof of unity and capability that external observers would respect, despite internal divisions that political maneuvering had created among various factions whose competing interests required careful management through leadership that balanced different demands. Alpha King Darius ruled through combination of personal strength and political acumen that had maintained territorial integrity while navigating complex relationships with neighboring packs whose alliances shifted according to perceived advantage rather than honor or tradition, despite formal agreements that supposedly governed inter-pack relationships through established protocols that practice often modified according to immediate necessity rather than consistent principle. Recent tensions had escalated beyond normal territorial disputes toward potential warfare that could devastate all participants through violence, that modern pack organization should have evolved beyond, despite lingering attachment to dominance culture that treated conflict as inevitable, rather than seeking diplomatic solutions that cooperation might provide through recognition of mutual interests that transcended individual pack boundaries. Public demonstrations of pack unity become necessary when external threats require visible proof of internal strength. Alpha King Darius had announced during assembly that addressed rising tensions while establishing framework for response that emphasized traditional values rather than seeking innovative approaches that changing circumstances might warrant through adaptation of ancient practice. As to contemporary challenges that required different solutions than historical precedent provided, individual sacrifice serves collective security when circumstances demand evidence of pack commitment to principles that external observers need to witness for evaluation of our resolve. He had continued with philosophy that subordinated personal welfare to group survival through logic that individual hardship justified broader protection, despite obvious inequality in burden distribution that CI concentrated cost among those whose social position made resistance impossible. Such philosophy typically resulted in ceremonial combat that demonstrated pack strength while providing entertainment, that reinforced social hierarchy through visible reminder of dominance relationships, that maintained order through fear rather than respect, despite theoretical commitment to justice, that official policy claimed to honor through established procedures, that actual implementation oft and modified according to political convenience. The arena combat served multiple purposes through combination of entertainment, social reinforcement, and political demonstration that external representatives could observe while evaluating pack capabilities for potential alliance or conflict according to strength assessment that traditional culture emphasized over diplomatic negotiation, despite obvious advantages that peaceful cooperation could provide through mutual benefit rather than competitive dominance. Tomorrow's combat would feature unusual participants whose selection had surprised many observers, despite logic that careful consideration revealed through understanding of political calculation that required visible demonstration of pack unity while providing convenient solution to social problems that individual cases presented through circumstances that made conventional resolution difficult etc. Achieve without creating precedent that broader application might make politically dangerous. The twin Omegas who had survived through careful anonymity would discover that some circumstances could not be avoided regardless of precaution, while learning whether their bond would prove weakness, that pack assumptions had claimed, or strength that ancient wisdom had forgotten through cultural evolution, that emphasized individual dominance over cooperative power that twin heritage might represent. Despite social prejudice that viewed such relationships as unhealthy dependence requiring correction through separation and individual development. Tonight, as preparation continued through anticipation that tomorrow's events would serve political necessity while providing resolution to questions about Omega capability and appropriate social position that pack hierarchy maintained through assumptions about strength and weakness that combat might challenge despite expectations that predetermined outcome would reinforce established order rather than revealing truths that comfortable prejudice preferred to ignore through willful blindness to potential that circumstances had never permitted proper evaluation or development. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The arena had been carved from natural stone formation that created amphitheater where pack gatherings could accommodate entire community alongside visiting representatives whose presence transformed local events into diplomatic occasions that served broader political purposes through demonstration of capabilities that neighboring territories needed to witness for evaluation of alliance potential. Or threat assessment according to traditional methods that emphasized visible strength over diplomatic negotiation. Ceres and Viola stood at arena entrance where preparation area provided final moments for contemplation before combat, that neither had requested, but which pack leadership had determined served collective interest through resolution of questions about Omega capability, while satisfying external observers whose evaluation would influence future relationships between territories, whose cooperation required mutual respect based upon demonstrated strength rather than theoretical commitment to peaceful coexistence. Remember what Elena taught us about moving together, Ceres whispered to her twin, with reference to adoptive mother's instruction about coordination, that years of shared existence had developed into instinctive harmony, despite pack disapproval of such close bonds that traditional culture viewed as unhealthy dependence requiring correction through individual development that emphasized personal identity over cooperative relationships. Trust the bond, Viola replied, with acknowledgement of connection that had sustained them through 18 years of marginalization, while providing strength that isolation might have destroyed through mutual support that transcended mere family relationship toward something deeper that pack understanding could not adequately explain, despite obvious evidence of capabilities that such unity had created through shared experience and complementary skills. Their clothing reflected Omega status through simple design that avoided ornamentation, while providing practical protection during combat, that ceremonial requirements demanded, despite obvious mismatch between their training and opponents, whose selection had been calculated to demonstrate pack strength through overwhelming advantage that should have made outcome inevitable, according to political necessity that drove event organization. 5 alphas, Vela observed, with assessment of opposition that numerical odds made formidable despite individual confidence in abilities that training had developed through Elena's instruction about combat techniques that formal pack education had never provided to Omegas whose social position supposedly made such skills unnecessary for roles that community structure had assigned through tradida. Ional division of labor. Alpha Theron's son Marcus leads them, Saris added with identification of primary opponent, whose reputation included victories that established combat credentials, while family position provided political protection that made defeat unlikely through advantages that extended beyond personal capability toward institutional support, that pack hierarchy maintained for those whose success served Estabo. Isht authority rather than threatening social stability. They expect us to fall quickly. Viola continued with recognition of assumptions that combat arrangement had been designed to fulfill through demonstration that would satisfy external observers, while reinforcing internal hierarchy through visible reminder of dominance relationships that pack order required through acceptance of natural inequality, that Omega status supposedly represented a cordon. G to traditional understanding of social organization. Public humiliation serves their political purposes more than simple defeat, Saris agreed, with analysis of circumstances that extended beyond personal combat, toward broader objectives that external demonstration needed to achieve through spectacle that would influence neighboring pack perception of Ironwood strength, while resolving internal questions about Omega treatment that some community members had questioned despite official policy. The crowd assembled with mixture of anticipation and uncomfortable awareness that combat arrangement served purposes beyond entertainment through political calculation that required Omega sacrifice for collective benefit, according to logic that individual welfare remained subordinate to group survival, despite moral questions that such reasoning raised about justice and appropriate treatment of immunity members whose contribution warranted recognition rather than exploitation. External observers from 3 neighboring territories, Viola noted with observation of diplomatic presence, that elevated local event toward interpack significance through attendance that would influence future relationships, depending upon demonstrated capabilities and cultural values that combat would reveal through behavior that reflected pack character rather than merely individual strength. Or weakness. Alpha King Darius arrives, Saris announced, with recognition of royal presence that transformed ceremonial combat into formal evaluation, whose outcome would establish precedent for future policy, while providing political theater that served multiple constituencies, whose interests required satisfaction through demonstration that balanced internal hierarchy, maintenance with external strength progy. Fiction according to complex calculation. King Darius occupied elevated position that provided clear view of arena, while maintaining appropriate distance from combat that royal dignity demanded, despite personal interest in outcome that political considerations had made essential for broader territorial relationships whose stability required demonstration of pack unity and capability that external threats had made necessary through escala. Tensions that diplomatic solutions had failed to resolve. Begin, commanded Arena Marshal, with authority that initiated combat whose predetermined outcome should have provided efficient demonstration of pack strength while reinforcing social hierarchy through visible reminder of dominance relationships that maintained order despite individual cost, that Omega sacrifice would represent, according to political calculation that valued collective security of their personal welfare. The 5 alphas advanced with confidence that numerical advantage justified, despite recognition that opponent selection had been made for political rather than sporting purposes, their coordination reflecting training that pack education had provided for those whose social position warranted investment in combat capabilities that Omega status supposedly made unnecessary for community roles that traditional structure had assigned. Marcus led formation with aggressive posture that establishment reputation demanded, while family position protected through assumptions about inevitable victory that social hierarchy made reasonable, despite individual awareness that circumstances contained unknown variables that combat might reveal through pressure that theoretical dominance could not always withstand when challenged by desperate opposition fighting for survival rather than entertainment. Together, Saris whispered to her twin with instruction that years of shared existence had made instinctive through understanding that individual capability remained insufficient against numerical odds that cooperation might overcome through coordination that training had developed. Despite pack disapproval of bonds that traditional culture viewed as weakness, requiring correction through separate on an individual identity development. Always together, Viola replied, with confirmation of commitment that transcended immediate circumstances toward connection that had sustained them through lifetime of marginalization, while providing strength that isolation would have destroyed through mutual support that created capabilities exceeding individual limitations, despite social assumptions about appropriate omega behavior and potential. The first alpha reached them with speed that combat training had developed through formal education, that pack resources had provided for those whose position warranted investment in capabilities that established social hierarchy, while denying similar opportunities to those whose status supposedly made such preparation unnecessary, despite evidence that all community members possessed potential that proper development could reveal. Ceres moved left while Vela shifted right with coordination, that created confusion among opponents whose training had prepared them for individual combat, rather than synchronized opposition, that moved with precision suggesting supernatural connection beyond normal sibling relationships. Despite pack assumptions about omega capabilities and appropriate social behavior, that cultural prejudice had maintained through willful ignorance of potential, that circumstances had never permitted proper evaluation. Impossible, Marcus muttered with recognition, that expected easy victory had been complicated through demonstration of abilities that omega status should have precluded, according to pack understanding of social hierarchy and natural capabilities that traditional culture had established through assumptions about strength and weakness that combat was beginning to challenge despite predetermined expectations about inevitable outcome. Their wolves had begun to surface with synchronicity that training could not explain through normal instruction about transformation techniques, the shared bond creating resonance between their supernatural aspects that enhanced individual capabilities through connection that pack culture had never acknowledged despite obvious evidence of phenomena that traditional understanding could not adequate. Healy addressed through established categories about natural versus unnatural relationships. Fight back to back. Elena's voice echoed through memory with instruction about defensive positioning that adoptive mother had provided, despite pack disapproval of combat training for omegas, whose social position supposedly made such preparation inappropriate for roles that community structure had assigned through traditional labor division that emphasized submission over capability development. Trust each other completely. Continued remembered guidance that years of shared existence had proven accurate through experiences that demonstrated connection beyond mere family relationship toward something deeper that pack understanding could not explain, despite obvious strength that such unity had created through mutual support and complementary abilities that isolation would have prevented from developing properly. The second wave of alpha attack encountered resistance that numerical advantage should have overcome through overwhelming force, but synchronized defense created barriers that individual strength could not penetrate, despite establishment training and family position, that should have guaranteed victory according to social hierarchy, that combat arrangement had been designed to reinforce through VS. Bible demonstration of natural dominance relationships. They're moving like one person, observed external representative with recognition of phenomenon that challenged assumptions about omega capabilities, while raising questions about pack assessment of individual potential that traditional culture had dismissed through prejudice rather than evaluation, based upon actual performance under challenging circumstances that revealed authentic character. Their then social position. Impossible coordination for untrained omegas, added another observer with assessment that acknowledged unusual demonstration, despite theoretical understanding of social hierarchy, that such performance seemed to contradict through evidence of capabilities that omega status supposedly precluded, according to established pack culture that measured worth through individual dominance rather than co-op. Narrative strength. Blood began to flow as combat intensified beyond ceremonial demonstration toward authentic conflict that served survival rather than entertainment. The twins' defensive capabilities proving more formidable than Alpha Advantage had anticipated, despite numerical superiority that should have concluded engagement quickly, according to expectations that political arrangement had been designed to fulfill. All through predetermined outcome. Something's changing, Viola gasped with recognition of sensation that transcended normal combat stress toward awareness of forces that their connection had activated, through pressure that desperate circumstances had applied to bond that pack culture had never understood despite years of observation that should have revealed potential that proper evaluation could have recognized through attention. into evidence rather than prejudicial assumption. Power, Saris acknowledged with understanding that their unity had accessed capabilities that individual strength could not achieve through connection that enhanced rather than limited personal potential. Despite pack assumptions about healthy independence that traditional culture had emphasized over cooperative relationships, whose benefit circumstances were beginning to demonstrate through that challenged every established assumption about Omega limitations. The arena had fallen silent except for sounds of combat, as assembled observers recognized that predetermined outcome had been replaced by authentic contest, whose resolution remained uncertain, despite political calculation that had arranged engagement for purposes that actual performance was beginning to contradict through demonstration of capabilities that social hierarchy had never acknowledged, or properly evaluated through fair assessment of individual potential. Looking into eyes of opponents whose confidence had been replaced by recognition of unexpected challenge, the twins understood that their survival required access to potential that years of suppression had concealed while learning whether their bond would prove sufficient against numerical odds that establishment advantage had created through social position and formal training that Omega status had been denied despite evident capability that circumstances were finally permitting to emerge. The transformation began with sensation that transcended normal shifting patterns, their wolves emerging not as separate entities, but as complementary aspects of unified force that pack culture had never recognized, despite evidence that twin bonds could create capabilities extending beyond individual limitations through connection that enhanced rather than diminished personal strength, according to principles that ancient wisdom had understood, but contemporary prejudice had forgotten through emphasis upon dominance rather than cooperation. Saris felt her wolf surge forward with power that individual strength could not explain, while simultaneously experiencing Viola's transformation through shared consciousness that made their separate existences feel like artificial division of unified being, whose true nature required both aspects for complete expression, despite social training that had insisted upon individual identity over Cooper. Added relationships that circumstances were revealing as source of exceptional capability. Their wolves moved with synchronization that challenged every assumption about normal pack behavior, each action perfectly coordinated with the other through connection that eliminated need for communication, while creating defensive formation that numerical advantage could not overcome, despite alpha training and establishment privilege that should have guaranteed victory, according to social hierarchy that combat arrangement had been designed to reinforce. By the ancestors, breathed Alpha King Darius, with recognition of phenomenon that royal experience could identify, despite unprecedented nature of demonstration that challenged fundamental assumptions about Omega capabilities, while revealing potential that pack assessment had completely failed to recognize through prejudicial evaluation that emphasized social position over actual performance under challenging circumstances. That's not normal transformation, observed external representative, with acknowledgement that supernatural elements had entered combat, whose political purpose had been complicated through manifestation of forces that traditional understanding could not adequately explain, despite obvious evidence of capabilities that exceeded standard pack parameters for individual strength or cooperative ability between siblings. The twins' wolves bore markings that no pack genealogy had recorded, despite comprehensive documentation of bloodlines and supernatural characteristics that formal record-keeping had maintained through generations of careful observation about inherited traits and capabilities that family heritage typically provided through genetic transmission of powers that established families possessed. Sigils blazed across their fur with patterns that suggested ancient lineage, whose significance had been lost through cultural evolution, that emphasized contemporary hierarchy over historical understanding about supernatural inheritance that extended beyond current pack structure toward connections with forces that modern civilization had abandoned, despite evidence that such relationships remained accessible under appropriate circumstances. Those markings, King Darius muttered with recognition, that royal education had provided about historical texts and genealogical research that documented bloodlines whose capabilities had shaped early pack development before political consolidation had emphasized territorial control over supernatural cooperation, that ancient wisdom had achieved through understanding of natural forces that contemporary culture had rejected. Convergence bloodline, confirmed royal advisor with identification that established records could verify despite apparent impossibility that such heritage had remained undetected within Pact territory, whose documentation should have revealed presence of individuals whose ancestry granted access to powers that proper training could have developed through recognition rather than suppression of potential. The third alpha fell with injury that synchronized assault had created through coordination that individual training could not achieve. Their combined attack, demonstrating tactical understanding that formal military education had never provided to Omegas, whose social position supposedly made such instruction unnecessary, for roles that community structure had assigned, despite evident capability a proper development could have enhanced. "They're not just fighting," observed external witness with assessment that acknowledged demonstration, exceeded mere combat capability toward manifestation of supernatural cooperation that challenged assumptions about individual versus collective strength, while raising questions about pack evaluation methods that had failed to recognize exceptional potential through prejudicial assessment-based upon social hierarchy rather than actual capability. "They're performing ancient combat forms," added another observer with recognition that historical study could identify despite rarity of practical demonstration that contemporary culture had abandoned through emphasis upon individual dominance over cooperative techniques that required unified consciousness for effective implementation, according to principles that modern pack structure had systematically eliminated. Marcus retreated with recognition that expected easy victory had become survival challenge through opponents whose capabilities exceeded every assumption about Omega limitations, while demonstrating fighting techniques that establishment training had never encountered. Despite theoretical superiority, that family position and formal education should have provided through advantages that circumstance were proving insufficient against unexpected opposition. "Impossible," he gasped with acknowledgement that social hierarchy had failed to predict actual combat capability, despite comprehensive evaluation that pack culture claimed to provide through assessment methods that emphasized conformity to expected patterns rather than recognition of exceptional potential that individual circumstances might conceal through survival strategies that protected unusual abilities from hostile attention. "Nothing is impossible when ancient bloodlines awaken," Saris replied, with voice that carried harmonics, suggesting supernatural forces had enhanced normal communication, while her wolf maintained defensive position that protected sister, despite individual risk that such cooperation created through tactical decisions that prioritize mutual survival over personal advantage, according to principles pack culture had never understood. "We are convergence," Viola added, with declaration that acknowledged identity that years of suppression had concealed, while circumstances were revealing authentic nature that transcended individual existence toward unified being, whose separation into twin aspects had been necessary for survival within cultural context that could not tolerate demonstration of capabilities that challenged established assumptions about appropriate power distribution. The remaining alphas regrouped with recognition that numerical advantage required different tactics against opponents, whose coordination eliminated standard combat strategies, while demonstrating supernatural enhancement that individual strength could not overcome through normal dominance techniques that pack training had emphasized over adaptive methods that unusual circumstances might require our successful engagement against unexpected opposition. "Surround them," Marcus commanded with strategy that sought to exploit spatial limitation, despite recognition that synchronized defense had proven effective against previous assault attempts, while demonstrating capabilities that Omega status should have precluded according to establishment understanding of social hierarchy and natural limitations that traditional culture had established through assumptions about strength distribution. "Separation tactics," confirmed second alpha, with military assessment that identified approach most likely to succeed against unified defense through forced division that might reduce coordination effectiveness, while creating individual vulnerability that standard training could exploit through techniques that formal education had provided for those whose position warranted investment in combat, ECE, abilities. But ancient power had fully awakened within twins whose heritage granted access to forces that contemporary pack culture had forgotten, despite historical evidence about supernatural cooperation that early civilization had achieved through understanding of natural harmony, that political consolidation had abandoned in favor of territorial control and individual dominance that served establishment interests rather than collective capability. "We cannot be separated," Saris declared with confidence that supernatural connection provided through bond that transcended physical proximity while creating shared consciousness that made individual targeting ineffective against opponents whose unity existed on multiple levels that normal combat strategy could not address through conventional tactical approaches. "We are one force expressed through two aspects," Vila continued with explanation that acknowledged metaphysical reality that pack understanding could not adequately comprehend, despite obvious demonstration of phenomena that challenged every assumption about individual autonomy and appropriate relationships between community members, whose cooperation could create capabilities exceeding personal limitations. The arena floor began to resonate with energy that their unified presence had activated through connection with forces that ancient bloodline had preserved, despite cultural suppression that modern pack structure had maintained through systematic elimination of supernatural traditions that challenged hierarchical authority while demonstrating alternative approaches to power that emphasized cooperation over dominance. "The stones are responding," observed external representative with recognition that environmental phenomena had entered demonstration whose political purpose had been transformed through manifestation of forces that exceeded normal pack parameters, while revealing potential that proper evaluation could have identified through attention to evidence rather than prejudicial assumption about Omega Cap. Abilities and appropriate social position. "Ancient arena," King Darius acknowledged, with understanding that royal knowledge could provide about historical significance of combat location, whose construction had incorporated elements designed to enhance supernatural demonstration, despite contemporary usage that had reduced ceremonial space to mere entertainment venue, rather than recognizing sacred purpose that original architects had intended. Dead. Sigils that blazed across twin wolves began to pulse with rhythm that synchronized with arena resonance, while creating harmonics that suggested communication between supernatural forces and inherited bloodline, whose awakening had activated dormant capabilities that proper training could have developed through recognition rather than suppression of potential that circumstances were finally permitting to emerge. They're accessing convergence power, royal advisor confirmed with identification that historical research could verify despite unprecedented nature of demonstration, that contemporary pack culture had never witnessed through practical application of capabilities that ancient wisdom had understood, but modern civilization had abandoned through political consolidation that emphasized territorial control over supernatural cooperation. The fourth alpha hesitated with recognition that combat had transcended normal parameters toward supernatural demonstration, that establishment training had never prepared him to address through conventional techniques, while circumstances revealed opponents whose capabilities exceeded every assumption about Omega limitations, despite social hierarchy that had seemed to guarantee predetermined outcome. "Me, what are they?" he asked, with question that acknowledged fundamental misunderstanding about identity and potential, that pack assessment had completely failed to recognize through evaluation methods that emphasized conformity to expected patterns, rather than identification of exceptional heritage that individual circumstances might conceal, through protective strategies that survival within hostile culture had required. "They are what we forgot we could become," King Darius replied, with recognition that royal wisdom could acknowledge despite political implications that such admission created for established hierarchy, whose authority rested upon assumptions about natural inequality, that convergence demonstration was systematically challenging through evidence of cooperative power that transcended individual dominance relationships. Looking across arena where twins had proven capable of challenging alpha supremacy through unity that pack culture had never understood, assembled observers recognized that predetermined outcome had been replaced by authentic contest, whose resolution would establish precedent for future understanding about Omega potential and appropriate social hierarchy. That demonstration was forcing community to reconsider through evidence that individual assessment had completely failed to recognize. The combat continued with intensity that survival rather than entertainment demanded, while supernatural forces continued awakening through connection, that years of suppression had concealed, but which circumstances were finally permitting to emerge through recognition, that their bond represented strength rather than weakness despite cultural prejudice that had interpreted cooperation as unhealthy. Dependence requiring correction through separation and individual development. The final assault came with desperation that recognition of failure had generated among alphas whose establishment training proved inadequate against opponents, whose capabilities transcended normal parameters through supernatural connection that ancient bloodline had preserved despite cultural suppression, that contemporary pack structure had maintained through systematic elimination of cooperative traditions that challenged hierarchical authority, while demonstrating alternative approaches to power distribution. Marcus led coordinated attack with techniques that formal military education had provided through advantages that social position warranted, despite growing awareness that numerical superiority could not overcome unified defense that operated according to principles his training had never addressed, through conventional combat methodology that emphasized individual dominance over cooperative resist, ants that circumstances were revealing as superior tactical approach. "End this," he commanded with authority, that establishment privilege had granted while recognizing that political necessity required victory, despite mounting evidence that predetermined outcome had been replaced by authentic contest, whose resolution would affect broader understanding about Omega capability and appropriate social hierarchy. That demonstration was forcing community to reconsider their unprecedented display of potential. The twins moved with synchronization that had evolved beyond conscious coordination toward instinctive harmony that made individual targeting impossible, despite tactical advantages that alpha formation should have created through superior positioning and numerical dominance, that establishment assumptions had claimed would guarantee successful outcome, according to social hierarchy that combat aura. Moment had been designed to reinforce. "Together until the end," Saris whispered through connection that transcended verbal communication, while their wolves maintained defensive formation that protected mutual vulnerability, despite individual risk that such cooperation created through tactical decisions that prioritized shared survival over personal advantage, according to principles that pack culture had never understood or properly allied. "Beyond the end," Viola replied with acknowledgement of bond that extended past physical existence toward spiritual unity, that ancient bloodline had preserved through inheritance that granted access to forces contemporary pack culture had forgotten, despite historical evidence about supernatural cooperation that early civilization had achieved before political consolidation had emphasized territory, control over natural harmony. The convergence power reached culmination through pressure that desperate circumstances had applied to capabilities that years of suppression had concealed, while supernatural forces responded to authentic need for protection against overwhelming odds that establishment advantage had created through political calculation, that individual sacrifice would serve collective demonstration of strength and unity. Light erupted from sigils that blazed across their combined form as twin wolves merged into single entity, whose power transcended anything normal pack hierarchy could comprehend through traditional understanding of individual capabilities, while demonstrating ancient truth that cooperation could create forces that dominated strength could never achieve through solitary effort despite establishment. Assumptions about natural superiority. Convergence manifestation. King Darius breathed with recognition that royal education had provided about legendary phenomena whose practical demonstration contemporary pack culture had never witnessed, despite historical documentation that ancient bloodlines could achieve unified consciousness, that enhanced individual potential through connection, that eliminated artificial separation between parading entities who shared fundamental identity. Impossible. Marcus gasped with denial of evidence that challenged every assumption about Omega limitations, while demonstrating capabilities that establishment privilege could not overcome through conventional dominance techniques that formal training had provided, despite theoretical superiority that social hierarchy claimed to represent through natural inequality that circumstances were systematically contradicting. The unified entity that twins had become moved with grace that transcended normal combat parameters, while radiating power that forced remaining alphas to retreat, despite numerical advantage that should have guaranteed victory, according to establishment calculation that individual sacrifice would serve collective political purposes through demonstration designed to reinforce social hierarchy rather than challenge fundamental assumptions. "We are convergence," declared voice that harmonized individual identities into unified expression, while maintaining distinct aspects that cooperation had enhanced, rather than eliminated through connection that preserved personal autonomy within shared consciousness, according to principles that ancient wisdom had understood, but contemporary culture had rejected through emphasis upon individual Elation and competitive relationships. We are what balance requires when dominance fails justice. Continued declaration that acknowledged purpose beyond immediate survival toward broader responsibility for community welfare. The convergence heritage had apparently intended through bloodline inheritance that granted capabilities designed to address systematic inadequacies that hierarchical authority could not resolve through conventi. On all approaches, the arena stones resonated with energy that unified entity had activated through connection with forces that original architects had incorporated into sacred space, whose contemporary usage had reduced ceremonial significance to mere entertainment, despite structural elements that remained responsive to supernatural demonstration that proper understanding could have anticipated through historical ire. A search and appropriate respect for ancient wisdom. The bloodline awakens. Confirmed royal advisor with identification that genealogical records could verify despite apparent impossibility that such heritage had remained concealed within Pact territory, whose documentation should have revealed presence of individuals whose ancestry granted access to powers that political authority had systematically suppressed through cultural evolution, that emphy assigns territorial control over supernatural cooperation. External representatives observed with mixture of awe and concern that demonstration created for diplomatic relationships, whose foundation rested upon assumptions about Pact capabilities that convergence manifestation was forcing complete reevaluation, through evidence that established hierarchies might not represent authentic strength distribution, but rather artificial limitation of potential though. To proper recognition could have developed through inclusive policies. This changes everything. Acknowledged neighboring Pact representative with assessment that regional relationships would require fundamental reconsideration based upon revelation of capabilities that challenged every assumption about natural hierarchy, while demonstrating that Omega classification might represent misunderstanding, rather than accurate evaluation of individual potential and appropriate. Yet social position. Ancient bloodlines carry responsibilities alongside power, observed another external witness with reference to historical knowledge about convergence heritage, whose awakening typically signaled need for broader social transformation, through recognition that established authority structures might require modification to accommodate capabilities that conventional hierarchy could not properly integrate or utilize effectively. The remaining alphas had withdrawn to arena edges where safety provided opportunity for reassessment of circumstances that had transformed predetermined demonstration into revelation of forces beyond normal Pact parameters, while challenging fundamental assumptions about social organization and appropriate power distribution that establishment authority had maintained through systematic suppression and of alternative approaches. What do you want? Marcus asked with recognition that combat had concluded despite lack of formal surrender, while acknowledging that convergence demonstration had established superiority that numerical advantage could not overcome through conventional techniques, despite establishment training and social privilege that should have guaranteed victory according to traditional hierarchy. Justice, replied unified voice that maintained individual harmony while expressing shared commitment to principles that convergence heritage had apparently intended to serve through bloodline inheritance that granted capabilities designed for community protection rather than personal advancement, despite cultural misunderstanding that had interpreted such power as threat requiring suppression rather than resource-deserving development. Recognition, continued response that encompassed acknowledgement of Omega potential, alongside broader acceptance of cooperative approaches that could enhance Pact capabilities through inclusive policies, rather than hierarchical limitation that wasted human resources through prejudicial assessment, based upon social position, rather than actual performance under challenging circumstances. Change, concluded declaration that acknowledged purpose beyond immediate survival toward transformation of cultural assumptions that had prevented community from recognizing and utilizing capabilities that all members possessed through genetic inheritance and individual potential that proper education could have developed regardless of social classification that artificial hierarchy had imposed. King Darius descended from royal position with recognition that demonstration had revealed inadequacies in Pact assessment methods, while establishing need for comprehensive reevaluation of social organization and power distribution that convergence manifestation was demanding, through evidence that established authority could not ignore without compromising community welfare and competitive capability. Liddy against external threats. Your Majesty, Marcus protested with appeal to hierarchical authority that combat outcome had challenged, while recognizing that royal response would establish precedent for future policy regarding Omega treatment and appropriate social organization, that demonstration was forcing leadership to address through recognition rather than continued suppression of exceptional potential. "Silence," commanded King, with authority that acknowledged superior demonstration, while recognizing that circumstances required response that served justice rather than political convenience, despite establishment pressure to maintain hierarchy. That convergence revelation was systematically challenging, through evidence of capabilities that could not be dismissed or explained through conventional understanding. Looking into unified gaze that reflected both individual consciousness and shared identity, King Darius recognized presence of forces that ancient wisdom had preserved through bloodline inheritance, despite cultural suppression, that contemporary pack structure had maintained through systematic elimination of cooperative traditions that challenged hierarchical authority, while demonstrating alternate approaches to power that emphasized collective capability over individual dominance. "I bow to convergence," he declared with acknowledgement that royal wisdom could recognize, despite political implications, that such admission created for established hierarchy, whose authority rested upon assumptions about natural inequality, that demonstration had systematically challenged through evidence of cooperative power that transcended individual limitations, while revealing potential that Roper recognition could develop. The arena fell silent, except for resonance that unified entity continued to generate through connection with forces that ancient bloodline had preserved, while assembled observers processed implications of revelation that challenged every assumption about appropriate social organization and power distribution that established culture had maintained through systematic suppression of alternative roaches that circumstances were finally permitting to emerge. "We accept your recognition," replied unified voice with formal acknowledgement of royal tribute, while maintaining dignity that demonstration had earned through capabilities that establishment privilege could not match, despite numerical advantage and formal training that should have guaranteed victory, according to hierarchical assumptions that combat had systematically contradicted through evidence of convergence power. "And we pledge our service to justice that serves all community members, rather than protecting established privilege through systematic suppression of potential, that proper evaluation could have recognized and developed through inclusive policies that honor individual capability regardless of social classification." Continued declaration that established framework for future relationship between convergence heritage and pack authority. As transformation gradually reversed through separation that restored individual identities while maintaining enhanced connection that awakening had established, twins understood that their survival had been purchased through revelation of capabilities that would reshape community understanding about Omega potential and appropriate social organization, through demonstration that cooperation could create forces that individual dominance could never achieve, despite establishment assumptions. The quiet Omegas who had learned survival through invisibility had discovered that some circumstances could not be avoided regardless of precaution, while learning that their bond represented strength rather than weakness, despite cultural prejudice that had interpreted unity as unhealthy dependence requiring correction through separation and individual development, that circumstances had proven inadequate for accessing potential that cooperation had revealed. An arena where ancient power had awakened through twins whose heritage granted access to forces that contemporary pack culture had forgotten, assembled observers recognized that predetermined outcome had been replaced by authentic demonstration of capabilities that challenged every assumption about natural hierarchy, while establishing precedent for future policy that would require comprehensive re-evaluation of social organization based upon evidence rather than prejudicial assumption about appropriate power distribution and community potential. 3 months later, the council chamber had been restructured to accommodate twin thrones, whose parallel design reflected convergence heritage while maintaining individual identity through architectural recognition that cooperation enhanced rather than diminished personal autonomy. Despite cultural assumptions that had interpreted unity as weakness, requiring correction through forced separation and competitive development that circumstances had proven inadequate for accessing authentic potential. Ceres and Viella occupied positions that balanced their new role as convergence advisors, with continued commitment to Omega welfare through advocacy that their background enabled them to provide, despite transformation from marginalized individuals into recognized authorities whose supernatural demonstration had established credibility that traditional hierarchy could no longer dismiss through prejudicial assessment. Monthly reports indicate successful implementation of inclusive evaluation protocols that assess individual capability regardless of social classification. Saris announced while reviewing documentation that administrative reform had generated through systematic revision of PAC procedures that prevented repetition of discriminatory practices that had wasted human resources through artificial limitation based upon establishment assumptions. Combat training programs now include cooperative techniques alongside individual dominance methods. Vila added with reference to educational innovation that convergence demonstration had inspired through recognition that alternative approaches could enhance community capability, despite traditional emphasis upon competitive development that had ignored potential benefits of coordinated effort and shared consciousness. Furthermore, continued their unified report that maintained individual voices while demonstrating harmony that ancient bloodline had preserved. Genealogical research has identified 17 additional PAC members whose ancestry suggests convergence potential through family heritage, that proper recognition could develop despite previous suppression that cultural prejudice had maintained. King Darius nodded with approval, that acknowledged transformation from predetermined hierarchy toward merit-based organization, that convergence revelation had necessitated through evidence that established assumptions about natural inequality, could not withstand demonstration of capabilities that proper evaluation could have recognized despite social barriers that had prevented authentic assessment of community potential. External territories have requested consultation about inclusive policies that enhance collective capability while maintaining appropriate authority structure. He reported with reference to diplomatic innovation that convergence demonstration had inspired through regional recognition that alternative approaches to power distribution might provide competitive advantage against threats that conventional hierarchy could not address effectively. Ancient wisdom proves relevant for contemporary challenges. Saris observed with perspective that heritage had provided through understanding that cooperation could create forces transcending individual limitation, while serving justice that honored all community members regardless of social position, through recognition of potential that proper development could enhance rather than suppress. The convergence awakens when balance requires restoration, Vila concluded, with acknowledgement of purpose that bloodline inheritance had apparently intended through capabilities designed to address systematic inadequacies that hierarchical authority could not resolve through conventional approaches despite theoretical commitment to community welfare and protection. Looking across chamber where ancient power had transformed pack culture through demonstration that challenged every assumption about appropriate social organization, the twins understood that their survival had catalyzed broader recognition that strength emerged through unity rather than dominance, while serving principles that honored individual dignity within collective cooperation. The Omega twins, who had been marked as expendable, had discovered that convergence heritage granted power to reshape destiny when circumstances demanded justice that established authority could not provide through conventional means, their bond proving foundation for transformation that would guide community toward authentic strength through recognition that cooperation enhanced rather than threat. Enid individual potential when properly understood and appropriately developed. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.